A Sedgwick County Commissioner out from under the cloud of federal criminal charges. Will his case change state campaign finance laws? And a handful of votes could decide whether a small Kansas school district can modernize its buildings and install storm shelters. Plus, the fight over state taxes, itemizing deductions and corporate benefits, is back in the Senate's court. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. Welcome to Kansas Week. I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. This time last week, Michael O'Donnell's future was in the hands of a federal jury. Now, he's a free man. The jury acquitted the Sedgwick County Commissioner on most charges, and the U.S. Attorney's Office has now dropped the remaining counts jurors couldn't decide on. Friday, O'Donnell sat down with case Greg Miller to talk about the case and how he believes it all came about.
They never once interviewed me about anything in this indictment. They never said, how did you spend your campaign funds? What's this check for? They never asked me a single question about this indictment.
So they had no concern, or
So what did they ask you about?
Well, you're talking about in the meetings that we actually had with them.
Yeah.
We can't talk about that.
How
But
come?
we can't. But what we can tell you is that when it comes to just the 26 charges that he was charged with, they weren't interested in knowing before they actually charged him what the real story was.
So let me just wrap my head around this.
Yep.
They called you in. They called you both of you in.
Yep.
And this was the U.S. Attorney's Office or the FBI?
The United States Attorney's Office, but there was a panel of people in there.
From where? FBI?
FBI,
Sure.
IRS, you name it.
They didn't ask you one thing about...
The charges that resulted.
No.
Not one.
They weren't even really asking questions about me. They were asking other types of questions when we went in, for the most part.
About a number of people that we don't feel comfortable saying, not at this point.
Now, one thing, this case has raised questions about Kansas state campaign finance laws. Will we see some changes after this? Joining me to discuss this issue and others today we have Senator Bruce Givens, a Republican from El Dorado, Jeff Jarman, political analyst from Wichita State University, and Representative John Carmichael, Democrat from Wichita. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here.
Glad to be here. Sure.
Thank you.
Now, this is a case that's been in the headlines for over a year now. We know that it first came out, the wiretapping was related perhaps to a gambling case, but that it also brought up some of these other things. And I know that, John, you're a lawyer. It's not unusual for investigators to try to push one case in the attempt to, shall we say, turn a witness.
Sure. And I don't want to try to address the facts specifically here because I don't know the discussions, but when you heard Commissioner O'Donnell's lawyer, Mark Schoenhofer, say we had conferences, but we can't tell you what we talked about, that would probably mean that they were interviewing the commissioner in connection with investigations unrelated to the charges that were actually filed against him. And I can speculate a whole lot, and we have been in the State House speculating for 2-3 years, but it's probably best not to do that.
Yeah, certainly speculation is not what we want. We want
No,
to talk about what it is that we do know. And when we're talking about a politician's career, Jeff, as we look at something like this, how does this now impact Michael's career from this point on out?
Yeah, it's important, I think, the fact that the jury came back not guilty and then the U.S. Attorney dismissed some charges helps, I think. But the charges themselves with the other issues he dealt with before, I think creates a condition where, donors going forward are going to have to decide, are we giving somebody money that's going to be used for a good purpose, and do we get someone reliable in an office? Or are there other people who they could target to be candidates for positions going forward? That's the real political challenge he faces.
Well, and certainly some of his larger donors testified in his favor in this case, but that's not a guarantee that all donors will stick around.
Yeah, I mean, look, people I think know when they're giving money that it's going to be used for a wide variety of purposes. I think the question, though, is things like retainers and having people just sitting around, whether that pushes the envelope too much and whether they'll maybe give smaller donations.
But we really ought to emphasize that Commissioner O'Donnell entered the courtroom with the presumption of innocence. The jury acquitted him on the majority of the charges. The prosecutor has dismissed the remaining charges. He is as innocent today as he was the day before the charges were brought, and it's not fair to him or our system to say, well, he was acquitted, but he still must be guilty of something. That's not the way it works.
No, I agree with that, but that doesn't mean that donors will continue to write $500,000 worth of checks.
Certainly, all I'm saying is that he is cloaked in innocence, so to speak.
Well, and as we talk about that donation issue, there has been a talk. I have talked with several politicians throughout this case who said that, you know, Kansas campaign finance law is, for lack of a better term, pretty loosey-goosey when it comes to something like this.
I don't know if it's loosey-goosey. I've only been in one campaign, but I'm extremely careful of my expenditures and the receipts. And when you have a question about any expenditure, I always call the election office and ask them if this is this an appropriate expense. I just don't do it.
Nah. Well, and that's actually one of the things that Michael testified to during the trial.
We wouldn't want the Governmental Ethics Commission to get into the business of figuring out what consultant you can hire, how much you can pay, whether this one worked hard enough, etc. But one of the fundamental problems we have is we have defunded the Kansas Governmental Ethics Commission to the point that last I knew they had about 5 employees. They do few, if any, actual audits anymore. It used to be a vibrant agency that made folks toe the line, but also you could call and they would be helpful. Today, they're overworked, understaffed, and you just can't rely on what somebody signs their name to. You need to be doing some audits.
Okay. Well, talking about that, that's a budgetary issue and certainly kind of a running theme throughout a lot of the other topics we're talking about today. It was a short week at the State House after lawmakers took a midterm break, but it was a long day on the House floor Thursday as they wrangled over the future of your taxes. The Wichita Eagle reports that as the House passed it, Senate Bill 22 could make your grocery bill cheaper, keep your income taxes from going up, and cost the state $500 million. Republicans are pushing the bill as a way to keep taxpayers from owing more money due to federal tax law changes. Democrats say they like the grocery sales tax and income tax portions of the bill, but dislike large portions of it they call a tax giveaway for big corporations that accounts for half the bill's cost. They warn the state can't afford to lose that much money when it's still not on solid financial footing and facing another possible recession. This is an amended form of the bill the Senate passed earlier in the session, meaning either the Senate will have to approve the House's version, negotiators will have to come up with a compromise version, or Republicans will have to let the bill go. That's not likely. Senate President Susan Wagle has called this bill her top priority for the session. Nor is it likely the governor will sign it, as long as it includes the corporate tax changes. Although I will say that on Friday, during a moment with the press, the governor did say she's going to wait until she sees how it passes and if it makes it to her desk before making a decision on whether or not to sign it. But everybody I've spoken with has said that if it includes the corporate benefits, she's probably not going to sign it. And that would set up a veto situation and probably the first major fight of her governorship with lawmakers, which is something I think she's kind of trying to avoid, Jeff.
Oh, you know, when she was inaugurated, talked about trying to bring people together. But the challenge, and I think these two can speak to it, is that her legislative priorities are expensive. They're going to cost money, and she's been counting on some of this revenue. If she has to give that back, then it'll be hard to fund schools and Medicaid and the other issues that she wants to make a centerpiece of what she's doing.
The $115 million contribution toward CAPERS also helps in that or reduce that ending balance, which she'd intended to amortize.
Yeah.
But part of Senate Bill 22, the repatriation and the guilty revenues had not been taxed before. So in the way I look at that the corporate side, if they haven't been taxed, and then we're going to let them bring it to Kansas, and we're not going to tax it, I don't see that as a tax cut.
Well,
and I would vote again to do the individualized piece. Even if it was separate, I think it would fly by both houses.
It would.
And signed by the governor. And I'd be okay with that too. That's the part that really gets me is that we've got 110,000 Kansans who are going to pay extra Kansas income tax at no fault, and it certainly wasn't directed by the Kansas legislature.
You know, the best information we have from the Department of Revenue right now, and that's part of the problem. We don't know what we're really going to receive from these changes, but the best information would suggest about 5% of Kansas taxpayers will fall within this gap that we're talking about here. It's important to take care of those folks, and it's not all that expensive comparatively. The rest of this is where the problems lie.
I've even received comments from tax preparers said, please don't mess with it this year. And I can certainly understand that.
Well, you know, my explanation of vote on the House floor this morning basically said, don't spend money that you don't have. Now, if it turns out that our coffers are full, that we don't have an economic downturn, that things are in good shape, then we can take a look at tax cuts and breaks for everyone. But this is not the time to give back 177 million, I can't remember the exact number, to so-called expatriate corporations, and these are folks who have avoided paying their Kansas taxes for years. We shouldn't do that right now.
Well, talking about the financial difficulties the state may or may not be facing, because we just really don't know right now. That's the issue. The Kansas House Republicans spent the last 3 days holding a series of Medicaid expansion roundtables. We expand Medicaid that could cost the state millions. They're trying to find out what expansion might look like in Kansas if lawmakers approved it. Spearheaded by the House Health and Human Services Committee, the roundtable discussions included supporters and opponents of expansion. Supporters say it will help stabilize the finances of many of the state's struggling rural hospitals. Opponents say it not only would cost the state money it doesn't have to spend, it would add to the nation's deficit because the federal government would cover 90% of the cost of expansion to Kansas's 10%. The Kansas Health Institute this week revised its estimates of the number of Kansans who would be covered by expanding Medicaid, down from 150,000 to 140,000. It estimates the state would pay more than $47 million in the first year, some $520 million in the first decade. Now, this is an issue I have reported on for I don't know how many years now out of the State House. Certainly, there have been numerous battles, but it seems after these 3 days of roundtables that there really hasn't been much change in anyone's position. In fact, Representative Dan Hawkins said on Friday exactly that. Nobody's moved. He still considers this to be a very bad idea. What would it take, do you think, and Bruce, I'm going to start with you this time, to move opinions on this case?
Well, I voted for Medicaid expansion, I believe it was 2 years ago, wasn't that right? When we both chambers passed it, and I would do it again because it would significantly help the 5 hospitals in my district. The rural hospitals really benefit the most. So but a lot of my friends that are in the Senate and House tell me that if it had a work requirement, they would change their position and vote for it. And I don't know what a work requirement would look like, but that's the key to many of them.
Okay.
By the way, I misspoke a minute ago. It's 137 million, not 177 million on the expatriate income. But the votes are there to pass this now in the same fashion that was there 2 years ago. The problem is that Republican leadership in both the Senate and the House don't want to see those bills on the floor. And we don't need to impose work requirements. All we need to do is just have an up or down vote, and it will pass. I'm relatively certain in both houses, and the governor says she'll sign it.
I think it'd be very close on the Senate side, but I think it would pass.
Same senators, I think, are there. Well, there's been a little change, but I think the votes are still there.
A fairly typical debate, wouldn't you say, Jeff, for states that are looking at this sort of expansion?
Yeah, you know, I think what we've seen in Kansas on this is that healthcare issues are the kinds of things that can be bipartisan. There are rural hospitals, regardless of maybe how they vote for governor's races or in their local elected races, need access to a hospital and need that kind of healthcare, and it's a place where common ground can be found. It's why it passed 2 years ago. but I think it's a political issue right now.
You know, Representative Jim Kelly from Independence was very strong in saying we need to do this. Well, he knows he's lost his hospital, and it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. When there's no hospital, you're in trouble.
Yeah, and he talked about in that hearing I was reading about that. He talked about how losing that hospital had ripple effects, loss of companies, loss of jobs, and people not wanting.
You know, new information that was reported even today on National Public Radio suggests that the states that have, the 37 states who have done this, it becomes revenue positive for virtually all of them because of what you're just saying. The jobs that are created by providing this health care, they result in additional tax revenues, and in the end, the states that have done this are better off than the states that have refused the money. It makes no sense.
Well, additional money is certainly something we all know Kansas could use, especially as it's facing a major issue this year. As something we know state lawmakers have to figure out is how to put more money into public schools. And they're down to about 4 weeks or so to do it now. A House committee debated and approved one plan this week, but it's one of many. And the governor's proposal, the one plan that had the approval of educational groups and Schools for Fair Funding, the group behind the school funding lawsuit, no longer does. Schools for Fair Funding says the governor's plan contains an arithmetic error. Their attorney, John Robb, says in order to make up for inflation, as the court ordered, by the 2022-23 school year, the state needs to phase in another $364 million in the next 4 years. The governor's plan calls for increasing the state's annual spending by $90 million, adding up to a total of $364 million spread over 4 years. The difference between the two plans is some $270 million. Lawmakers have to get a plan to the Attorney General by early April in order to comply with the state Supreme Court's deadline. Okay, so school funding has been the ogre on the back of governors in Kansas for decades. Jeff, is it any surprise that Laura Kelly is now facing this dilemma?
Well, this is a curious problem, I guess, really, and one that I'll be curious what these guys say about how this is going to get fixed, because she won by making education and funding a central part of what she was promising. And I think a reason why Kansans voted for her was because of their broad commitment to fund education at a higher level. And now the challenge appears to be on our legislators here to figure out how to make up that difference, in part or in whole, at least to satisfy the court.
The Senate's going to take it up first. It came out of committee, and what the Senate did was split the governor's proposal into two parts, sent part of it to education and the other part to Ways and Means. Mm-hmm. And the part that went to education came out of committee, and that's basically addressing the foundation aid to schools, which is the biggest requirement.
And that's the stuff dealing with inflation,
yes,
and those additional costs under the Supreme Court's ruling.
Now, I know Schools for Fair Funding said there's an arithmetic mistake, but this also, the governor's proposal parallels with the state board's proposal. So it meshes the two. So there must be two entities doing bad math and not just one. So I believe when 142 comes out to the Senate floor, we're going to pass it and send it to the House.
Well, I'll tell you, the senator and I, we agree on this, and both of us ran on saying we're going to fund our schools. Last year at the end of the session, Representative Ed Trimmer said we need to put in an extra roughly $94 million to deal with the inflation factor to satisfy the court. Schools for Fair Funding said yes, that's the right number. Meanwhile, KNEA and some other organizations said let's go ahead and vote for what we've got. At any rate, the way that ended up being resolved is it went back to the court, and the court said you got to take into account inflation. Now Schools for Fair Funding is asking for more. And it plays right into the hands of the conservative Republicans who say, and that's not I don't mean to impugn you, but the people who are tough on this, it plays right in their hands because it sounds like they're never satisfied. Once we get to a number, we reach an agreement, then they want more. Now, I hope that's not the case, but I find the data from the State Board of Education to be far more persuasive than from a group of plaintiffs in a lawsuit.
Well, and the plaintiff's attorney, John Robb, was saying this may be a situation where they just have to let it go to the court and let the court decide.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I remember voting on it last year. I said it on the Senate floor, I think it was like 1 o'clock in the morning. I passed on my ballot, and it came around, and we had 20 votes for it. I wanted to vote against it because I didn't believe it had enough. But I voted for it.
Well, I had a luxury because I was able to vote against it for the very reasons that you cite. There were enough votes to pass it. My argument was we shouldn't leave it in the hands of the court. We ought to do our job, we ought to fund it, but I do not fault those who did vote in favor of that package because elsewise the doors could have been locked.
Okay, well, we know schools are asking for that money. They say they need that money, and it's at the root of a close vote in the Remington School District. Voters approved a $10 million bond by just 20 votes, maybe. KSN's Craig Andrus explains.
So literally, with only 20 votes between passing or not passing, some of the school board members out here say this is all about safety, and they're very hopeful that this thing will get pushed through.
This is the tornado shelter for the students and the staff.
Remington School Board member Brad Crisp says they need tornado shelters at some of the schools, but they're also asking for a new gym.
It's not an ideal setup for our coaches or for the visiting teams either. It's tight, which is kind of good.
The old gymnasium is not KSHSAA approved. It's 10 feet too short, so that's on the list. And voters definitely split.
I voted yes because the 3 schools definitely need better security.
The school would move the front office to the front of the building, and they would add a new security system with cameras. But some farmers point out while the owner of a $100,000 house would pay $90 a year more, farmers would pay even more. That is if the bond passes.
I'm just tired of paying taxes as many as we pay. Not as much. It's not banging it so big at one time.
Rick Miller says the school should have scaled back the bond issue and tried to do less. But it's not a done deal yet. 30 provisional ballots still have to be certified and then counted. They are going to be canvassing on Monday. We'll bring you the results when they are available. Outside Whitewater, Craig Andrus, KSN News 3.
And that tight of a vote in a case like that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, probably would have passed easily. But the continued fighting in Kansas over school funding, I see showing up in that vote. Are you reading it the same way, Jeff?
Yeah, a couple of things. Yes, there's some fights over school funding. It also illustrates the difficulty that very small districts have with raising money. I mean, the amount that they have to raise requires significantly more taxes than in the larger districts. It's one of the reasons why state support for bond initiatives is so important and how difficult it's been in recent years as that state aid for bond initiatives
It's
has
also why
come
it's
down.
important to have weighting for small school districts in the formula because it's more expensive per pupil in a small system than a large.
Yeah.
Full disclosure, my day job is working as a special education administrator in Butler County. Remington's one of my schools that I work with. So I hope it passes, but for
one of the things
staff's sake.
that troubles me, though, is sometimes the timing of these issues. For example, the Wichita Board of Education has now requested permission to increase the local option budget levy so that we get the maximum number of dollars from the state. And I understand why they're doing this, but why do they have to do it now? Because it contributes to this perception that the schools are asking for more, and now we want to have a local option budget and pay our administrators more and fill more of those positions. It just all plays into this anti-education theme. I don't agree with that, but it makes our job a lot harder in the legislature when they do things like this.
Well, and Jeff, I'm going to ask you to put your other hat on real quick as president of the May School Board here. There's
full disclosure.
Yes. There is a time limit that districts are facing when it comes to some of these bonds right now.
Right. I mean, there are rules at the state now about how much total bond the state will support, and it's a challenge for districts. There'll be a race coming up here for July 1 to get next year's bonds approved. Right. And I think this is a good example of what districts have to do, where they pair things that they need, upgrades that are decades old in need for a district, with things like safety and security. The idea that they need to pare down their bond.
all true.
They just want to build safe and secure entries to their buildings, and I think we have to figure out how to support that.
And that's not
Okay,
a school board's
I'm going to
fault.
interrupt right there because we've got one more topic and we're running out of time. It sounds like a deal too good to be true. $1 an acre for land valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars. The city wants to sell 4 acres around the new stadium to members of the baseball ownership group. And that has a lot of Widgetons demanding to know what's going on. We go back to KSN's Craig Andrus for the story.
It seems a little foolish to be so far down the road, and as a citizen, it feels like we're being held hostage.
Todd Ramsey, one of several who went in front of the city council Tuesday to say we should have heard about this $1 an acre land deal long ago. Mayor Longwell says his hands have been tied on negotiations because of rules with minor league baseball. No contract signed as of yet.
So we don't have a deal until we all sign the contract. The reality is that's how deals work.
But while the mayor and a few others have been negotiating that deal, some have been arguing they wanted more time to review it before the city council voted.
I understand that there's some limits as far as minor league baseball and things like that. But as soon as there was a deal in place with all of the major parties involved, they should have started putting this information out there for the public to consume.
And with the deal now going public, city council members are asking for public input, and they have delayed a vote on the deal for 2 weeks down the road, so residents can have a say.
Let's find out what the questions are and see if we can get those answered in 2 weeks, and then we can make a decision in 2 weeks.
Now, transparency, a big issue when you're talking about trying to get things done through politics. Jeff, how much is this hurting the city that there's this issue of transparency going on?
It looks bad, and that's the thing that they should be more concerned with. The idea that this deal to bring the team here includes a new stadium and 4 acres isn't that big of a problem unless you hide the 4 acres for $4, bringing it out at the end. I think probably we'll find that the deal is not so bad, but how we learned about the deal makes it seem even worse.
Well, that's certainly what I was kind of getting as I was talking to folks about that story on Wednesday, Tuesday. This week is blown by. And that came up, even city council members admitting that there was a need for more transparency as they did a social media discussion, question and answer session on Thursday. So yeah, transparency. We'll have to see if they continue and do anything more. And I'm being told we are completely out of time. Bruce, Jeff, John, thank you so much for being here. I've enjoyed our discussion. I hope you have as well. If you have questions, we'd love to answer them. Just look for us on social media, Pilar Pedraza TV or KPTS Channel 8. For now, have a great week.